This lecture continues the later Middle Ages and what will become known as the rise of the Gothic from many of the innovations we have discussed at the end of the Romanesque era, including rib vaulting and new structural approaches to sculpture and architecture. The division of the Gothic periods are as follows: early, high, and late. The early Gothic will begin with Saint-Denis being built and the expansion of the use of rib vaulting that allows for these structures to get ever taller. The High Gothic begins with the rebuilding of Chartres that we will look at next in 1194. And then finally, the late Gothic is going to begin with the dedication by Louis IX of Chartres in 1260. So therefore, the building of the Chartres Cathedral is going to be one of the most important milestones for this type of art. In the Gothic age, we find that the Hundred Years' War will define the countries surrounding England and France who would be locked in this seemingly never-ending conflict, with other nations taking sides and or attempting to remain neutral in Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Papal States in Italy. Now, the Gothic, importantly, is going to be a misnomer, for Goth refers to the Germanic tribes who sacked Rome in the 5th century Common Era. More properly, this work would be known as Opus Fracaginum, and or French work, that roughly would come to dominate European art and culture between 1200 and 1400. These 2 centuries will see a widespread adoption of many of the building techniques and stylistic characteristics that find their origin in France. The reason why we call this period Gothic today is thanks to the father of art history, Giorgio Vasari, who wrote in his Lives of the Artists, chronicling the rise of Renaissance art, that the period directly before his own, the beacon of light that resurrected Roman antiquity, was a Gothic, monstrous, and barbarous period that was dominated by those peoples who had sacked Rome, the Goths. So Vasari misidentifies the style dominating this period as one that is Germanic rather than French, as we now know. Now, the Hundred Years' War, in which we find France and England will be locked in a contest to try and rule over both countries, as the English king puts, of course, one of his relatives on the French throne. Individuals like Joan of Arc will fight to dislodge this foreign monarch, as the French see it, and kick him out back over to England. This conflict would last between 1337 and 1453. Coming to define this age. Though seemingly an oxymoron, because the French Gothic literally would translate the French Germanic style, this is going to be more properly known and identified as the International Gothic, or courtly style, which was created for the court in France, and would represent the monarchy, the king and queen of France, and then this courtly style, this elegant style, would be adopted throughout Europe in areas that also wished to portray a courtly elegance. Now, this is going to coincide with the emergence of a well-established centralizing force of the monarchy in France at the same time, not surprisingly. As well, another very important shift happening at the time is towards universities as centers for learning and education that would slowly supplant in this period monastic schools. The rise can be seen here in universities at Bologna, Padua, Paris, Cambridge, and Oxford. These would come to be centers that would lead to modern-day universities, not sponsored by the church, but as independent scholastic entities. Individuals like St. Thomas Aquinas would come to define the era, this Italian theologian writing his Summa Theologiae, and he would help make Paris the intellectual center of Europe. Not only is it going to find the stylistic impetus and creative spark there, but also an intellectual one, where scholasticism, promoted by St. Thomas Aquinas in these universities, would attempt to reconcile older notions of Christian theology with newly rediscovered classical philosophy, applying the classical question and answer method to Aristotelian logic. This was to help individuals comprehend the supernatural and explain the existence of God through various proofs and arguments. Bringing these two unique forces together, that being the rise of the monarchy as a centralizing force in France, and this new interest in intellectual rigor and capacity with Paris as the capital of the intellectual world, we have a century in which 2,700 Gothic churches will be built in France alone. That is 27 churches a year, a staggering number. This is made possible because of the situation where we have new ways of thinking, where we geometrically order architecture and see the rise of naturalism in sculpture and painting. Here at Saint-Denis, we have the burial place for the French monarchs and the birthplace of the Gothic, showing us the new innovations that were learned from the Normanization of England that we talked about last time, such as the cathedral at Durham. In the section previously reserved and designed for pilgrims in the Romanesque era, the ambulatory and the appropriate radiating chapels, we have a new technology observable if we look into the vaults, with the now easily identifiable X-shape or quadripartite rib vaulting. Here, if we look at plans for a Romanesque church with an ambulatory, such as St. James at Santiago de Compostela, and compare that to Saint-Denis, we see by comparison Saint-Denis is seemingly made up of and designed around a series of intricate web-like designs. Those lines represent ribs that are going to become increasingly complex and will shift the weight of a structure to make new engineering principles possible. Walking around this area reserved for the sarcophagi and the burial chapels of French monarchs, we can see, even though it is fairly low, the potential in this new building technology. Turning to Durham Cathedral, where we left off last time, where the vault is going to be a scant 73 feet tall, we still have the technology necessary to move into this new period, where we saw groin or rib vaulting that will place or pinpoint the weight of the roof of the vault on narrower and smaller areas until we have a pier cluster. Rib or groin vaulting, seen here with pointed arches, is one of the easiest stylistic markers of the period. Instead of having rounded arches, as in the Romanesque, we now have pointed arches, and we also use less material. With less material and the pinpointing of the weight to these particular piers, we have a new type of building technology, which is very obvious when looking directly up at the vault. Here, the groin vaulting can be seen just as with the term we use. A groin is where two things come together. In this case, the groin is where the transverse and diagonal ribs are going to come together. They're going to intersect in this way, usually giving us an X-shaped pattern for quadripartite rib vaulting, though we will also look at sexpartite rib vaulting. This, as we can see, places all of the weight of the vault we're looking at right here on these two columns to either side of us here and our viewing angle. Now, if we are to expand on this building technology, we are able to come up with amazing new structures. In the cathedral at Chartres, we see what can be done with such new engineering technology, where the emphasis is going to be placed not on geometrical harmony, for the plan here is not symmetrical, nor are the features of the structure, but instead we're going to be focusing on vertical orientation, grand height, how tall can we make these structures? The new engineering devices created assisted in reaching these grand heights, where pulley systems and weight systems will be created. Here we see a manuscript illumination with these masons at work in the 1240s, showing us how they were able to lift these building materials hundreds of feet up into the air. Now, just as the Freemasons today are known for their secrecy, these masons, or individuals that worked with stone, cutting it and laying it, were going to be organized into guilds, or these organizations that controlled the training of a particular craft. They guarded the secrets of these engineering technologies and devices very carefully and closely, passing them on father to son so that the knowledge remained within this particular craft. The result of such knowledge can be seen here at Chartres in a spectacular first example of a high Gothic cathedral. The section we're looking at here, however, is from the original part of the church built in the early Gothic. So here is the so-called royal portal that is left over, this facade here, the west facade, standing from the first version of the church built between 1145 and 55. In this royal portal, named as such because in the jamb statues that flank the doors, we have sculptures of Old Testament kings and queens. We also have a fairly standard church portal, or a set of 3 doors that are decorated with sculpture, much like the Romanesque church portal, where we find that the joggle voussoirs, archivolts, the tympana, and the various jamb statues and trumeaux all are going to find decorative carving on them. In this instance, we find that the archivolts, those areas that are going to be above and flanking the tympana, are going to show the 7 liberal arts, whereas the capitals, which were historiated beginning in the Romanesque era, are going to illustrate Christ's life from early birth until death. Off to the right, we have an image of the enthroned Madonna and Child, showing us that the cult of the Virgin would peak in this Gothic era. Here, the cult of the Virgin peaking shows that, even on these cathedrals, we showcase the Madonna as the Queen of Heaven, as she intercedes on behalf of the faithful at the Last Judgment, which we see in the center as Christ is going to be in the second coming, flanked by the 4 gospel writers. Here we have the same image that's carried on since the 6th century of an enthroned Madonna with a crown, with a Christ child dressed as a philosopher on her lap, showing that, like the Queen of France, we have the same style reflected also in the Queen of Heaven. So just as the Queen of France rules over this world, so too does the Virgin rule over the next. At the center of this royal portal, we have a tympanum that shows the second coming of Christ, one of the most popular subjects in church portals since the Romanesque era. Here, we're going to find that Christ is shown not judging the saved and the damned, but instead will have the elect below him and be flanked by the 4 symbols of the gospel writers. Here in the second coming, we find that Christ is going to hold his teachings in his left hand, seated and supported by his left knee, raising his right hand in a blessing of benediction, inside of his oval body mandorla or halo, with a cruciform halo identifying him as Christ. On all four sides, you'll see that he has the symbols in order of the gospel writers: the angel, eagle, bull, and lion. These, of course, are symbols of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That is going to be common in the reemergence of monumental stone sculpture from the Romanesque era onwards. Now below we see where this portal gets its name, with the elongated jam figure statues below of Christ and flanking the three main doorways or entrances. Here, with the Old Testament kings and queens, the jam statues are going to literally support the New Testament figures above, again in a typological fashion, showing us that the Old Testament foretells, bolsters, or supports the New Testament. Just like we looked at earlier at Saint-Pierre et Moissac, where we have the Old Testament figure possibly of Elijah or Ezekiel with these elongated lions supporting the New Testament second coming above. Now the early Gothic style carries on that elongated approach that we saw last time with the late Romanesque in areas like Saint-Lazare, where we find that Christ and other figures will be rigid, frontal, and elongated, that being the style carried on from the Ottonians and influenced by the Byzantines, with an emphasis on large eyes, gesticulation, right, but conforming or covering up the anatomical details beneath the robes. Here we have three male figures, or kings, and one queen. Notice that they all are going to have identical poses, with their right hand on the top of a book while their left hand supports the lower section. We find the beards are even similar and fall in the same way, especially the king to the far right and the one second from the left. Now the bodies, of course, are going to be quite elongated, and their feet seemingly float in the air on the edge of these projections on the columns on which they rest. Now the style, of course, is coming from and continues that Romanesque interest in elongation, in careful gesticulation, and in an emphasis on the eyes. The idea, however, of having a figure standing in for a column is certainly not medieval, nor is it Christian. Instead, this comes from the classical world, one of the most obvious examples coming from the Porch of the Erechtheion on the Acropolis in Athens, where a caryatid is going to be shown here balancing a contrapposto pose, many of them in a row. So we, of course, do not have the body conforming to the same shape and size of the column as we see at Chartres. So this need not be the case. We can show a three-dimensional naturalistic figure if we try. Now this begins to shift when we transition to a new phase in the Gothic, beginning after a fire in 1194 destroys the cathedral at Chartres. Now the builders, architects, and sculptors retain the west facade, keeping it intact, the royal portal that we just saw. The rest of the structure, however, they build with new engineering principles and technologies, ensuring that the structure is much taller and larger than it had been before. This is going to become the first high Gothic structure, and high, of course, is the operative term here, as the vertical challenge of Gothic builders is taken to the fore and carried on. Here we find what we can actually do with the new rib vaulting technologies once we add a few additional support elements. Now, looking at the plan for the structure and the spires in the front, we should note again that symmetry and balance, and geometrical symmetry especially, was not the goal of these designers, these masons, these architects. Instead, it is grand height. For we must note that the two spires on the front of the church do not match. The plan with the transept, the size of each arm, do not match each other. The plan, however, is incredibly ambitious, at 100 feet longer than the plan for the Cathedral of St. James we looked at, that massive pilgrimage church in the Iberian Peninsula dedicated to St. James. This one now 430 feet long, and you'll notice the interwebbing and design, the X shapes that are going to be in the vault. So quadripartite rib vaulting is now used instead of barrel vaulting in the earlier structure. What this allows us to do is minimize the structural weight and lateral thrust of the building and pinpoint that on more of a skeletal system. So here we notice we have flying buttresses that are externally supporting the structure of very thin, compound piers in the nave arcade, so that the structure is going to be pressing in on itself, as we find the ribs would be again splaying outward. The vaulting web between the transverse and diagonal ribs above in the ceiling show us how the weight is distributed downward, whereas lancet windows, or those bullet-shaped stained glass windows, make up the clear story, letting in light to the structure. The new addition here is the triforium, or the area just below the clear story, which is a mezzanine level, allowing the monks and priests and ecclesiastical members of the church to walk around the second level freely. The cutaway section here shows us quite clearly that Gothic cathedrals, beginning in the High Gothic period, are going to become nothing more than skeletal apparatuses, that they're going to support themselves not by way of sheer mass or the weight of masonry walls, but instead of high, spindly structural supports that are going to showcase how they stand up externally, as though we're actually leaving the ribs of this beast visible. Showing the plans and elevation side by side, we can see what this new building technology allows, and that is increasingly greater scale, verticality, and height, that from generation to generation is going to exponentially grow hundreds and hundreds of feet. Now, if we look at the height of the vaults, this can immediately be compared by looking at Romanesque churches like Saint-Foy, which are around 70 feet tall, not that uncommon for Romanesque barrel vaults. Now we nearly double that with Chartres, 121 feet high, and that will only increase as time moves on and the limits of this new technology are tested. A more appropriate comparison could be made between Gothic architecture and that of Byzantine, for the design with Byzantine architects whereby pendentives would pinpoint the weight to 4 specific piers off to the side creating spandrels is going to provide a much more vertically oriented structure that Gothic architects so envied and wished to emulate. Now, the additional creation of a triforium, the band between the upper and lower stories, provides us with an arcaded wall passageway or mezzanine level that will become one of the hallmarks of Gothic cathedrals. In addition, the lancet windows above, making up the clear story, are now tall openings with pointed tops surmounted by circular rose windows or oculi, oculus singular. The plate tracery or stonework elements surrounding the stained glass support it, holding it in place. This will, of course, expand until these stained glass areas will make up the entire portion of the wall as a skin between these skeletal rib-like elements. Now, perhaps one of the most identifiable aspects of Gothic art and architecture is stained glass. Here we have the Notre Dame de la Belle Vierge, in which we have a Virgin and Child and angels at Chartres Cathedral, with an enthroned Madonna and Child dressed as, with the colors of, and wearing a crown that would emulate the French Queen. In this case, appropriately, the patron for this work, Blanche of Castile. The plate tracery, or the black areas around the colored light coming through the stained glass, is actually stone, holding these very heavy sections in place. Now the Queen of Heaven here, enthroned, dressed in blue, with the Christ child on her lap, is meant to relate to the Queen of France in this courtly style, for she wears a crown with a fleur-de-lis, she wears the color of the French monarchy, and once again, it's appropriate because the money to create this wonderful stained glass example comes from the French Queen herself, Blanche of Castile. The notion of having a cult of the Virgin is appropriate when the French king and queen, the monarchy, wish to reinforce their divine right to rule by way of the Catholic Church, confirming and ordaining the selection of the king and queen for the country. So too do they want to anchor and reinforce that notion that they are like the king and queen of heaven, only here on earth. The image that we have here of the Madonna and Child thus connects the French Queen as she is seated on a throne with the iconic image of the Mother of God, thus granting the same level of authority, religious authority that is, to the secular rulers of France. Now another stained glass window, famously the rose window, which has lancets below it, is going to be made up of quatrefoils, or four-lobe designs, each containing fleur-de-lis, just like the crown of Blanche of Castile as the Madonna a moment ago. Here below, we find that Saint Anne is going to be shown with the baby Mary, her daughter, flanked by the Old Testament figures of David, Solomon, Aaron, and more, as they are going to foretell the coming of Christ. Above, we have a virgin and child enthroned, surrounded by doves, angels, kings, and prophets, all of which are going to connect the Old Testament to the New Testament. The kings and queens, the monarchs of the Old Testament, are important for the French monarchy, for they foretell that the French king and queen will, of course, take over as well. Here we have a detail of Saint Anne holding the young Madonna in her lap, showing us that as Saint Anne will immaculately conceive the Virgin Mary, so too will the Virgin Mary in turn immaculately conceive Christ above. The importance of stained glass, however, is not entirely aesthetic, and some of the theological implications of light metaphysics need be pointed out here. Specifically, the presence of light on earth is understood as the reflection from God's countenance reflected through the mirrors of angels. Hence, what we see as light on earth is actually God. Therefore, as God will enter the church as light passing through glass, this is how theologians explained that God as light was able to enter the Virgin Mary without once again taking her virginity, allowing her to remain pure. So light passing through glass does not break it. Instead, it remains intact. Therefore, light coming in through the stained glass, through the Virgin Mary here, we literally see God entering the church, being made corporal, being made fleshly here. While the architecture of the High Gothic age is going to get taller and more vertically oriented, while stained glass becomes more complex, taking up a greater and greater amount of space on the walls, so too, interestingly and conversely, does sculpture become shorter and more appropriately proportioned and naturalistic. Thus we find a new High Gothic sculptural approach, seen here in one example on the Porch of Confessors, named as such because we have three saints, Martin, Jerome, and Gregory, known for their role as confessors. Now, comparing these two sets of figures, we should note how the High Gothic examples are going to be more carefully differentiated between one another, being shown at different heights, wearing different ecclesiastical garments, their hands in different positions, not all holding the same book, but gesticulating, lifting and lowering, with different types of hairstyles and facial hair, looking in different directions, talking and engaged with one another, versus the elongated and rigidly frontal approach of the early Gothic example we have here on the left. Their feet as well, importantly, are going to nearly be perpendicular to the background on which they project. Therefore, they more appropriately seem to support their own weight. This is going to be seen even more so in the figure of Saint Theodore off to the side, a military saint, where now we have fleshed out in the round a discrete contrapposto, as he is going to be wearing chainmail, holding a spear, holding once again a shield in his left hand as well, with a sword tied around his waist, prepared to go into battle for the armies of Christ. Looking at the details between the two, we can also see how more carefully observed St. Theodore is, and the details on which he is going to be built. His hair cascading in a courtly fashion around his head. He is clean shaven. His chainmail individually are going to be represented and differentiated. We find that he is engaged with something outside of himself instead of staring blankly ahead. Now his eyes are fixed at something off the horizon. This is also known as the Classical Revolution, which takes place right before the Renaissance. In order to make these discrete contrapposto statues, they had to have had awareness of and would have modeled on the classical examples that had survived. And Paris and other cities in what the Romans called Gaul, what we now call France, would have been abundant. And certainly they could have looked at them to understand how a body would shift, right, its weight, how once again we can have this twisting three-dimensionally in space. And so we have, even before the Renaissance, an interest in attempting to recapture the vivacity and the clarity of classical statuary. To start out, we look at the northeastern section of the Kingdom of France and the city of Reims, a very important intellectual center ever since the Carolingian age. Reims is going to be an area that was prized by Charlemagne, that had a series of schools associated with it that he established. Now, the original church here was destroyed in 1210. Therefore, a new Gothic version was built over it, carrying the High Gothic even further, of course, until its final expression in the Late Gothic. This church, importantly, served as a coronation church for the kings of France until the 19th century, when Napoleon would break this tradition. That means that any time a new king or queen was crowned, they would process down the nave of this church to receive the blessing of the bishop. The expense of this new High Gothic structure is going to cause revolts in the 1230s and drove the Archbishop of Reims into exile twice. The massive height here, we can see where the expense came from with these 266-foot tall towers on either side of this sculpturally encrusted facade, where every single section and unit is going to be encrusted with sculptures that project from the wall. There is in fact no flat wall here. We have a series of convex and concave surfaces, or even those that are hollow. As you can see, the spires are on the sides. If we are to compare the cathedral at Reims with churches in the Romanesque era, such as Saint-Vincent, we can see how we have transitioned fully from those mute facades that do not speak without decoration at the outset of the Romanesque era, to fully decorated and fully encrusted ensembles with narrative and iconic sculpture, generally telling the story of Christ or his mother's life. This level of sculptural detail is continued throughout the church, all the way around, even in the flying buttresses, which previously were only used as necessary supports for the structure. Now even these engineering, very simple structures, are going to have the same level of highly decorative effect as the facade. The plan here for Notre Dame at Reims is going to be different from earlier Gothic churches like Chartres, where we are de-emphasizing the transept. It is folded almost entirely into the nave. The reason here is going to be processional because of the coronational relationship. We need to emphasize the long vertical walkway where kings and queens would then receive the crown once they had taken over as the next monarch. Despite the different shape of the plan, the elevation remains the same as the first High Gothic cathedral, Chartres, where we find a three-story elevation with the nave divided into the nave arcade in the lower section, the triforium above it, and then the clear story letting in light through lancet windows at the top. The brighter open interior that we see here compared to Chartres, however, is due to a new innovation in how stained glass is held in place. For now, we're going to have a new type of tracery that is going to be used. The bar tracery, in fact, seen here are thin stone bars called mullions, which are inserted into this expansive opening in the wall. They form, much like insect-like insertions, this form of lacy framework for the stained glass. Thus, of course, a larger section can be held. This replaces the older plate tracery that was much more bulky and cumbersome. Therefore, now we have even larger stained glass windows. In this instance, we find the west wall visually dissolves into colored light. This can be perhaps even more effectively seen from the exterior at Reims Cathedral, where we have a coronation of the Virgin in the central portal, which is just in front of that tracery that we just spoke of. Here we have the cult of the Virgin continuing in the Gothic era even up until the Renaissance, where we find the coronation of the Virgin is appropriate in this church, where kings and queens would also be crowned. How appropriate that they would associate themselves with the King and Queen of Heaven seen here. The continuation of the cult of the Virgin is not the only thing that we find that is carried on from the last class we discussed, where we found a classical revolution underway in figures at Chartres on the Porch of the Confessors with individuals like Saint Theodore. Here, on the main facade and the jam figures at Reims, we have a continuation of that same revolution. Here in the Annunciation and Visitation, we have a set of figures that are going to be directly related to classical sculpture that would be available in the area, where we find the first set of figures is going to have the Archangel Gabriel announcing to the Virgin Mary that she will give birth to the Son of God. The second set of figures is going to have the Virgin Mary and her cousin Elizabeth, who is older than her and pregnant with St. John the Baptist, the cousin to Christ that she is pregnant with currently. Now we know that Reims is a major Roman city going all the way back to the time of Gaul, and the remaining ancient works that are there would have supplied excellent models for artists to work from in looking at the drapery, the poses of the figures, anatomy, and contrapposto. Now, if we compare the figures at Reims to the royal portal from Chartres, it becomes immediately evident how far artists have come in carefully observing anatomical proportion and detail. For the figures are no longer elongated. Their feet are carefully planted now on these platforms that are suspending them in space, perpendicular to the columns on which they once were attached and rested. Now they twist in space, gesticulating, talking to one another, with, of course, a clear differentiation between the young, beautiful type of the Virgin Mary and the middle-aged type of Elizabeth. This is much more accustomed and related to classical drapery. Here we have examples of the type of statuary that the French sculptors would have had access to in order to understand how drapery would fall in a classical sense. In this instance, being pulled rhythmically across the body, around the Virgin's right arm, held by her left hand in place, to emphasize this very elegant S-shape. In addition, the two women conform to the imperial facial ideals that go back to the Augustan and Flavian eras, where we have a youthful, beautiful types and then an aged type, to where we find the Virgin Mary and Elizabeth here. Comparing, of course, the facial features, it is very obvious to see how and where the French sculptor has derived his inspiration, as the Madonna tilts her head upward, looking out in this concerned fashion, while her hairdo more appropriately reflects that of Greek statues, parted in the middle and curly. Now, the increased classicism seen here is both in the drapery, the careful attention paid to portraiture, and the contrapposto, or the distribution of weight along one leg, allowing her right leg to be relaxed, thus giving us that swaying motion, that S-shaped motion so characteristic of this age. Next class, we will continue on with the late medieval period in France by way of Saint-Louis and Sainte-Chapelle.